message from John McDonnell, or have you got it and can read it later? I've sent it to your phone, so
okay, I'll read
you've got it.
Why don't you start and I'll read it later. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, Chris, thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you to all the other people that have spoken and spoken so well and in such an informed way. I wish that all debates about Ukraine in our national media were so well informed, because there is a distinct lack of balance in any discussion about this in our media. There's an assumption that the solution to all problems is to go to war. That I find very depressing. There have been some very how should I put it, unfair remarks made today about the Stop the War Coalition. Let's just get the record straight. Stop the War Coalition was founded in 2001 after the attack on the World Trade Center. We condemned the attack on the World Trade Center, but we said an invasion of Afghanistan and the occupation of Afghanistan is not the solution. And 20 years later, British troops have finally left Afghanistan, with all the thousands dead and the terrible plight of the hunger of the people of Afghanistan at the present time. That was a war that was goaded into by the world's media and by the idea that the only solution to a problem is to send the troops in and bomb. I think people should just think a little bit before they say anything about that. And then later, our opposition to the Iraq war, we were similarly condemned as being pro-Saddam Hussein. I just have to say on the record, I was one of a very, very small number of members of parliament, you could count them on the fingers of one hand, who opposed British arms sales to Iraq in the 1980s because we were not supporters of that regime. By not supporting a regime, it doesn't mean you want to go to war with them. It means you want to bring about peace for the people of that area and those people. And so this event this evening is to ask people to think a bit more carefully about the situation facing us at the present time, and obviously facing the people of Ukraine and the people of Russia. We have an atmosphere of daily film of tanks and troops on one side of the border in Russia, and demonstrating that there's a huge Russian military presence there on the border. We then have other film of described as lethal weapons being shipped into the Ukraine, and huge demonstrations of military hardware in Ukraine, all building up on both sides. It is incredibly dangerous. And it's the US with British support that is leading the way on this. And it is the European countries, particularly France and Germany, who are urging some caution, and indeed the ones that are trying to promote diplomatic approach to this and some serious talks between Ukraine and Russia. And whilst Liz Truss is today in Moscow, and I have to say, I think it's a good thing she's gone to Moscow. I hope she's gone there with the intention of trying to bring about a diplomatic solution to all this, but I don't know. I think the proposals put forward by Macron and others are more likely to bring about some solution to all this. And then there is the question of the previous agreements that have been made. In 1991, at the end of the Soviet Union, there was a declaration of independence of the Ukraine, which was overwhelmingly carried through the Ukrainian then communist authorities to be independent, and Ukraine was recognized by Russia as it was by many, many other countries. And later, there was, after the issues about Crimea and the eastern parts of Ukraine, the Minsk agreement was reached. The Minsk agreement was a basis, as Richard was pointing out earlier, which could have prevented a further military conflict coming along. And so I just think we need to send out a very strong message that there has to be a diplomatic solution to this issue. There has to be peace, and there has to be an accommodation of the people's needs within Ukraine, as well as a non-aggression by anybody. So surely that has to be a good basis on which we go forward. Because I just ask you to think through where this leads to now. With all this massive military hardware on both sides of the border, something could go wrong. A mistake. A plane accidentally overflies. Somebody shoots that plane down. There's then a retaliation. There's then another retaliation. There's then another retaliation. You can see where all this goes to. This is an incredibly dangerous moment. And so we don't need blanket approval for war from various countries around the world. What we need is a recognition that all conflicts have to be resolved politically in the end. So why don't we get on with a political solution to the conflict at this very moment? And so the build-up of NATO forces in Ukraine, which is not a member of NATO. There are people in Ukraine that would like to join NATO. There are people in Ukraine that would not like to join NATO. That's a decision that will be made at some point in the future. Personally, I think the build-up of a military presence on the borders of NATO to Russia is something that will only encourage the development and increasing of troops' presence on the other side of the border. And so what we're saying tonight is simply this. The British government, which Andrew Murray was quite correct to point out, is the issue that we have. We are the Stop the War coalition. We are here in Britain, and we have criticisms to make of the British government. Boris Johnson, who probably for his own political reasons, to get out of all the other problems he's got, headed off to the Ukraine and has made increasingly bellicose statements about the need for and preparedness for armed conflict in the Ukraine, and keeps on thinking he's in some kind of historic moment. He does tend to model himself on Winston Churchill rather too often for comfort. They are simply backing the idea there is only a military solution to this issue. Well, there isn't. There has to be a peaceful solution. And I think it is the job of all of us to speak out for peace, to speak out for dialogue, to speak out for a diplomatic solution to this conflict, and to cease the buildup of forces. Now, under successive questioning over the last few weeks, the British position, the British government's position, seems to have changed somewhat. We started off with Ben Wallace telling us there was no British military involvement in the Ukraine, but we were a supplier of weaponry. We were then told there were British troops there to ensure the weaponry was properly installed, and that there were then an increase in the number of British troops that were there for training. We're now told that there are troops ready to support any action that happens in Ukraine. So we've had, without the start of any hard conflict, hopefully never, but yet, a mission creep of the British involvement in this. Make no mistake about it, if a conflict takes place, I suspect the British government will be sending British troops there. Goodness knows for how long, goodness knows what the consequences of that conflict will be. There will be tens of thousands of people on both sides of the border killed. There will be a destruction of infrastructure, a destruction of towns, of cities. There will be a most horrible and frightening war. And both sides have access to nuclear weapons. Ukraine does not itself possess nuclear weapons, and indeed, to its credit, renounced the holding of nuclear weapons on independence. But obviously, NATO has access to nuclear weapons, as does Russia. And so I also suggested to Liz Truss that in her visit to Moscow, she should also say that Britain was prepared to engage with Russia through the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and through the Global Ban Treaty Conference, which will be held this summer in Vienna, where we would be, if we joined in it, joining in with 159 other nations around the world that have sought to end the use and legality of nuclear weapons. Britain, unfortunately, is not one of those. So can't we turn this issue round? Instead of the tension leading to the danger of a war, turn this round and say this is a moment for peace. It's a moment for diplomacy. It's a moment for understanding. It's a moment for recognizing the human rights needs of people on all sides of this, and turn it into a wider movement towards peace. And I'll finish with this, Chris. The COVID crisis has shown us just how vulnerable this world is, just how vulnerable this world is to the consequences of inequality. And real security doesn't come from war, doesn't come from conflict. Real security comes from healthcare, education, housing, work, the ability of young people to be able to live their lives in peace. That is why we founded the Stop the War Coalition. That is why we've been around for much longer than ever thought we'd need to be around. But the tensions now on the borders of Russia and Ukraine show how right we were to found the Stop the War Coalition, and how important it is to have that coalition of people wanting peace, not war.